not just a lecturer, but storyteller.
Women could be members, but they were not voting members. And women weren't actually voting members until about the end of the 19th century. So they were not.
Churches were so important to government and to the people and to the community, but why was that so important when the founding fathers got together and said we got to keep the separation of church and state? I think the answer is that I don't quite understand what separation of church and state means.
First of all, the early Puritans did have separation of church and state after that. There were secular civic officials, and then there were ministers. And the ministers were not part of the governing structure. They just made sure that the rulers knew what the ministers wanted. So there was a certain amount of separation of secular and church business. But the other answer to your question is that New England is not typical of the rest of the country. Massachusetts, you paid taxes to support the Congregational Church until 1833. The Constitution, constitutional amendment that you didn't have state support for religion, that's part of the Constitution, but all the states had to then go through and ratify it with their own Constitution. And New England, or Massachusetts, was dead last because of that, because they had been on the tax dole for so long.
I never heard that before.
Yeah. And so it was, you could be a Baptist or a Quaker, but you had to still pay taxes to the Congregational Church if you were not completely outlawed. So, yeah. But that's just the way people were used to doing things. I mean, it was the system of denominational pluralism and diversity, and nobody did that anywhere. Think of New York and Pennsylvania and places like that, particularly Pennsylvania. They were owned by, William Penn, or, who established it as a sanctuary for Quakers, but because he wanted more people to come and settle there, increases the value of the real estate, you invite other faiths. So he invited Anabaptists, Mennonites, and from Germany, and then they had Welsh, all different Presbyterians were all kind of invited over there, and that's where these little experimental hothouses like Pennsylvania were really where Americans learned how to say, it's really okay that the people down the street are worshiping in a different way than I am. It doesn't bother me. New England had the hardest time with that.
They were escaping the harsh, the government says you got to do this religion. I thought that was why we came to America, was for that type of...
No, because what they came here to do was to create what they called this godly commonwealth, the city on a hill. Things had gone so awry in England that it was impossible to reform it. And so the only way that you could really change things was by coming over here, setting up a perfect society, and then all the rest of the world would see what they were really after. And so it was really high stakes to have a godly society. We think of it, yes, they were intolerant, but at the same time, they were in a covenant with God to do this holy commonwealth, and if you failed or if you let in unworthy people, you were in trouble. Our ideas of being tolerant or intolerant or freedom of worship, they didn't apply when they came over. All they wanted was kind of to be left alone to do their thing. And then that meant that they were intolerant of other people.
Some people think it's a political reason, like they didn't want the Roman Church
Right.
to make decisions that affect policy, that type of thing. That was always the thinking, but...
But the idea was that the government would not have an established church where everybody paid taxes.
Exactly.
And so when they, when Thomas Jefferson, championed the separation of church and state, The story is that the Baptists in New England, who'd been, illegal and beleaguered for so long, they were so excited over this that they thought, we have to give him a present or something to show him our appreciation. And the only thing they could think of was a giant wheel of cheese. And so they wheeled this, they brought this giant wheel of cheese all the way to Washington, D.C. It must have not been in great shape by the time it got. But that was, the giant wheel of cheese. When you think of separation of church and state, think of that. It was people like the Baptists and the Quakers who really wanted the government to stay away from them.
Where is the library?
It's 14 Beacon Street, which is the kind of the old home address of the Congregational Church. We are on the second floor of what's known as Congregational House. It was where all the old Congregational offices were. And so you'll see in the front, 4 bas-reliefs of the Pilgrims having their first worship service, the founding of Harvard College, John Eliot preaching to the Indians. You come and visit, you can see we have a little piece of, a fairly large piece of Plymouth Rock, which, probably came here when it was still okay to take off a piece. It was given to us by a pastor. We also have pieces from the original church in Scrooby, the carved pew backs, the little podium that where the first pilgrims came from. We have all the records of the Old South Church, which means that we have Benjamin Franklin's baptismal record. Yeah, usually, nobody knew he was famous then. And we have an original of the Cambridge Platform, which was published in 1648, is the kind of the constitution of the Congregational churches. We have a copy of the John Eliot Bible, which was translated into Algonquin Indian language. Unbelievable, 1659, a whole Bible translated into a Native American language. So, we've got pretty cool treasures.
I've heard these stories or read them or something about how people used to walk 5 miles in the snow to get to church in Duxbury and then leave. And I imagine it must have been pretty traumatic for that large a number of people to leave that church and build one here.
Especially in the 1600s, they were still laying out their farms in long strips of land the way they did in Europe. Theirs were long strips of land, and so all the homes would be along the main street. It was really important to have people living together. If you're a covenanted community, people really did keep track of each other. And so when the population grew and there were people who had to have farmland further out, everybody recognized that as a problem. And not just that they couldn't get to church, but they couldn't be part of the community. The ideal size for a congregational church was about 100. So the idea that people could not get to church on Sunday, everyone understood that these separations happened all the time, and they were not usually that traumatic. And family groups tended to go with family groups. So it would have been just understood that we're doing this. They need to be able to get to church. They would start in the morning, and the opening prayer would be an hour long, and then they'd have the sermon, and then they do some lining out, and you can imagine it took a long time. Then they'd break for lunch, and then they'd do the whole thing in the afternoon. This was before there was a such thing as pro football, or this was pretty and a lot of these ministers apparently were pretty entertaining. Although I read this one, visited this one church, and I read some of their history. And during the afternoon service, the minister was kind of smiling as he was giving the sermon, and everyone was smiling during the sermon. Well, what was wrong? What was wrong? And so they asked him, and he said, well, I was smiling because I was giving the same sermon you heard this morning, and nobody noticed.
Usually it was somebody in that community that was the pastor?
Could have been someone from out of the community, but they would have this meeting typically, ideally, and they would write their covenant, and there's a guy sitting there, and everybody knows he's going to be. We're not like eeny, meeny, miny, mo. They know they wouldn't have the meeting unless they knew there was someone who was going to be able to handle the church. And so in the early days, it was just assumed that these men would stay there for their whole career. They very rarely moved.
Did this church start out as a Congregationalist church?
Yep. Yeah.
Now, how many were they throughout New England?
That's all there was. That's all there was. And so, but they didn't, you know, since there was no other competition, they didn't really have to use a brand name.
Okay.
So that's why, you know, you see First Baptist Church or First Presbyterian, but there's this First Congregational is the first church.
Right, and congregation just really pretty much means run by the congregation. But whenever I've gone to see my brother in Tennessee or friends in Florida, I never see congregational churches. So is that why they're really pretty much primarily in New England?
In Western Massachusetts, when they weren't, if they wanted to survey the land and sell it, they couldn't do it until they could prove that they could support a minister and a church. You know, so that it's very integral. It takes a long time to establish one of these churches. And so other groups like Methodists and Baptists were really fast on the ground. They didn't have to have an ordained minister, you know, you could just start something and move on and start something else. So the Congregationalists they also joined with the Presbyterians around 1800 and said, let's do this together. Let's settle the wilds of New York State and Ohio, you know, hand in hand. And basically, without going into the details, the Congregationalists kind of got their clock cleaned. It was not happy, and so you will find Presbyterian churches across New York State and Ohio that maybe once were congregational or went back and forth. The eastern part of Ohio, known as the Western Reserve, used to be part of Connecticut. And so you have congregational churches in eastern Ohio. And then they spread all the way. There's a lot along the West Coast. Berkeley was started by Congregationalists. You know, there's pockets of very influential Congregationalists out there. So they never were in the South. They had a reputation for being anti-slavery, so they were out. Nobody wanted Congregationalists in the South. In 1931, the Congregationalists merged with a small denomination known as the Christians. And like the Congregationalists, this small group, they didn't have a lot in common, but they didn't believe in creeds. Congregationalists, you know, didn't believe in dogmas or rules. I mean, theology was important. It was very important what you believed, but you didn't agree to the dogma in order to get into the church. You agreed afterwards, you know. And so the Christians shared that. No creeds, you know, as barriers to people. The United Church of Christ was born in 1957 when they merged with a group called the Evangelical and Reformed. The thing about Congregationalism is it's always, why it's interesting, it's always a paradox, a tension, because yes, every church sits on its own, you know, own float, you know, that each one is separate. Every church has all that it needs to be a church. They don't need a bishop from outside, and they are sufficient. But that doesn't mean that they're separate or alone. And so back in the early days, the churches corresponded with each other all the time. You know, we have this problem. What would you guys do about it? What does your minister say? The ministers would meet together. And of course, they always had a problem about, you know, what if somebody goes off and starts preaching something really weird or stupid? And, you know, we can't tell them not to hire that guy, you know. So they also really wanted to find a way to have, I guess we call it quality control. So always in congregational history, it's a tension. There's not enough centralized control. There's too much centralized control. And so, you know, the people who joined with the UCC said, you know, this kind of all working together, centralized, you know, being in cooperation with other churches, that's congregational. They emphasized that side of it. The people who didn't want to join emphasized that, no, each church has to be a rule unto itself.
You spoke to that a little bit in your sermon when you mentioned that the Congregationalists didn't want to advocate for the incredible. And, you know, the 3 in 1,
Yeah.
which is the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, seemed rather incredible. So the Unitarian, in many towns, you're looking to see there'll be a Congregational church facing the main street, and directly across the street, facing the other way, is the Unitarian church. Those terrible
Yeah. Do you want to know
hypocrites.
why that is?
Yes.
What evolved in New England was kind of what we call a parish system, you know, where the parish was the whole town. Everybody paid taxes to support the church and pay the minister's salary, right? And then the church itself, it was another level. You had to have a conversion experience, or be able to witness to your faith to be a church member. And so in Dedham, Massachusetts, around 1820, the church, people in the church wanted to call a new minister Calvinist, conservative. People living in Dedham said, "Oh, must we? We don't want to hear that coming out of the windows on Sunday morning." And so they said, "Look, we're paying the bills. We own the property. We should be able to say who gets to call the pastor." And so it went all the way. This is called the Dedham decision. It went all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "Look, the people who pay the bills, who own the property, are the church." So that meant that the people who were kind of the inner group really left, because the parish went Unitarian, and so the Congregational church, separated out. So you can imagine they weren't real happy about this.
Well, that's my hometown.
Well, and that's why you see the first parish church is often in eastern Massachusetts is a Unitarian. First parish, Unitarian. First Congregational church is the Congregational church, because they left. And so like in Dedham is another places, they built right across the street. Someone stole the communion silver so the Unitarians wouldn't get it. And then the story goes in Dedham that the Unitarians then moved thetheir front doorway, so it was outside, So, yeah. So this was very bitter. And so you see a lot of the Congregational churches were in eastern Massachusetts, built in the early 19th century, 1820s, 30s, 40s, because they had to separate out from the Unitarian church. The literacy rate here in New England, even for women, was close to 90%. You had to be literate to read the Bible, of course, to understand the sermon, and so you were required by law to teach your children to read and so forth, or have a school. And so having an educated ministry was just, of course. They started Harvard College to train their clergy. When Harvard got too liberal, they started Yale. And then, of course, Andover, when the Unitarians took over Harvard, their missionary organization was called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. They established schools because they thought, how can we really teach someone to be a Christian unless they can read the Bible, unless they can think for themselves? The American College in Beirut was a Congregational school. The Punahou School that Obama went to in Ohio was in Hawaii was a Congregational school. The school in South Africa, Ananda Seminary, that Oprah Winfrey used as her model for her school, is and was a Congregational school. I've been to visit some of these. There was one at the American College in Greece. It was a Congregational school. They've forgotten this, but it's this incredible legacy. A Japanese man who became a Congregationalist in the 1870s. He escaped from Japan when it was illegal, and was rescued by a ship captain in Hong Kong, came here. This ship captain sponsored him. It's a great story. He sent him to Amherst and Andover Seminary. Then the guy went back to Kyoto and started a school. Well, every year we get about 100 Japanese middle schoolers in the Congregational library because they're going back to visit that heritage. Those original churches, if the minister preached, even here, you could ask him a question afterwards, or you could take issue with him. There was one story I heard of, this was in Barnstable or Yarmouth, I think, where one of the deacons was so upset with what the minister was preaching, he didn't agree with his theology, that he went in and nailed the entrance to his box pew, so that, and he said, "I'm not coming back until this guy is gone." I had so many funny stories. There was one from the church in Rowley, which dates back to the 1600s. It was during the time of the witch trials. And there were some, one of the women who was, kind of contentious, and I think her name came up in the witch trials. After church, she went up to the minister and she was really upset, really mad. She was angry because there was a group of boys sitting in front of her who were giggling during the service. Of course, they never do that now, but back then. So upon investigation, and this is in the church records, why were those boys giggling? Because one of them broke wind during the service. There's this universal voice that age just find this hilarious. There was that one minister, was it Morrill Allen or Reverend Smith, the one who had a sense of humor, and people were, you remember he was at tea. One of the ladies of the church invited him to tea, and she had baked, banana bread or whatever they did in the 1700s, and she said, "Oh, Reverend, I am so embarrassed to offer you this poor bread." And he said, "Oh, well, I don't eat poor bread," and so he didn't. That's in that book, yeah.
Right, if you want more of some of the little stories about the ministers, it's in our book that we published this year for our 300th anniversary. And there's still couples.
Yeah.